guys, my name's Emma. If you've never seen my face before, welcome back to my channel. So today we are going to be doing all the books that I read in 2024. Now, just a little note about this video. This was decided by my subscribers over on my community tab. So if you haven't already subscribed, I'd really recommend subscribing just to kind of see what videos I'm coming out with, but also be able to put your input in on what I choose to come out with next, because this video, at least at the time of recording, was the most voted between two options. Also, leave any comments down below if you have any other suggestions. Really grateful for my community members that voted for this, especially because I've really been wanting to lean back into kind of the reading content on my channel, because my channel is first, oh my gosh, I cannot speak. It is a little late. My channel is first and foremost a reading and writing based channel, although I've kind of been leaning a bit more into school lately. That's why I started it, and I'm really excited to do this video to kind of reconnect back with the purpose of my channel. So without further ado, get cozy like I am. I basically work not full-time, but a summer job, sometimes from 9 to 4, which is a bit much, basically 7 days a week. If not, no, it's mostly 6, but that is why I have to film my videos a little late at night like this. So if I'm a bit loopy and stuttering over my words, please excuse me, and let's get on into the video. So I'm looking at my Goodreads on my phone, and I am going to start from the beginning of the year. I have it in chronological order. I'm going to say like what I rated it on Goodreads, and then kind of my thoughts and if I would recommend. All right, let's go. So the first book on my list is Emma by Jane Austen. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, and honestly, it wasn't that the book wasn't 5 stars, because I actually ended up loving it so much more than I thought I would, really, especially like the comedy aspect. I found it surprisingly witty and funny. Not that I ever expected less of Jane Austen, but I just hadn't really read one of her books that was a little bit more like comedic. I had mostly read like the other Pride and Prejudice type things that are a bit more lovey-dovey, even though they definitely have wit to it. So anyway, all that to say, I give this a 4 out of 5 stars because I was kind of in a reading slump at the time of this, and I don't know if anyone can relate, but basically when I'm not reading consistently, sometimes it will affect my thoughts on the books that I'm consuming, especially with Emma, where it's kind of hard to not necessarily get like the chronology, but process the plot in a way that's really meaningful. If you're not reading it like consistently, it can't, I don't know if what I'm trying to get across, I'm stuttering a little bit, but basically, if you don't read it as consistently, especially with old books like this, you tend to kind of lose the plot a little bit, and that's a little bit what happened to me with this book, and why I gave it a 4 instead of 5 stars, because I believe it did take me quite a long while to read, but not because of like the quality of the book, just because I didn't really have as much time with like Christmas break and stuff. So I would recommend this if you like any sort of Jane Austen, and also just like for the wit and humor. Also, side note, I really loved the 2020 movie. I don't know if anyone feels the same way. I know it's kind of hated on in the community and just like online, but I thought it was really great and really captured the spirit of the book. So if you liked the movie, or like if you read the book and are looking to explore the story in a way further, I would recommend the movie, but that's just me. All right, so the next book I read in 2024 was Lightlark by Alex Astor. So I gave this a 4 stars on Goodreads, but honestly, in hindsight bias, I think it probably deserves maybe a 3, just in how much I enjoyed it, not necessarily in the quality, although I tend to be quite nice on Goodreads, especially when I finish the book, because I'm like, dang, I just read that. Why would I rate it low? But in my mind, I would give it probably a 3, just because it is just kind of an average fantasy book. I think that the premise is interesting. However, it's a little too filled with predictable tropes to, I guess, like communicate a meaningful story, or I don't know, to provide something unique is more what I was trying to say. Like, it is a bit too cliche to provide, I think, like the unique and fresh fantasy story that the author was aiming for. And I may be alone in this opinion, but personally, I've read a lot better fantasy books. And with books like this that get a lot of, I guess, like book talk or online hype, I'm always kind of skeptical about them, but I give them a chance. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy this book. I definitely liked, it was an entertaining read, but for how much hype it was getting, it didn't really provide anything new, nuanced, or even like terribly exciting in the fantasy genre. Just because it was entertaining doesn't necessarily mean it was like the best. So I would recommend it if you like fantasy. Just keep in mind that like it is maybe a little trope filled, and I guess take that into consideration. If you really don't care and you're like, I'm a book talk, I'm a trope girl, give it to me, then just read it. But I thought, in my opinion at least, the tropes kind of took away from some of the more interesting setup. For example, like the world or like more interesting character building. And also I didn't really connect as much with the main character. She kind of gave me like Wattpad protagonist vibes. There were a little bit of like, there were a few moments there where her outfits and like her were described for a little too long, and I was like, who are you other than a pretty girl who's like also I don't know. There was just not much depth to her in my opinion, but that's just me. All right, so the next book I read was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and I gave this a 4. So basically I really liked this book, but for some reason, I don't know, it didn't really connect with me in the way that I hoped. It kind of felt like a lot of setup and not necessarily a satisfying payoff, especially with the ending, which can be so frustrating in a book with a good premise and setup, because you're like, dang, I really wish I would have just loved it all the way through. And unfortunately, I didn't as much. I also felt that, I don't know, the writing style was a little dry for me. I didn't necessarily like whiz through it, but that wasn't to say that the writing wasn't good. It was just a little bit like different stylistically, I think. It had good descriptors and like the world was very creative, so I really give it props for that. But again, I think a lot of like the setup wasn't necessarily, I don't know, I just don't think it paid off in the way I maybe would have wanted to. But again, I'm very biased. So if you loved this book, then I totally get it, because it was good. Just maybe not like my favorite. All right, so the next book I read was, basically I have like this shelf and I'm looking at it right now and it is so full. It's not even a shelf. It is the entire top of my dresser of books that I like have yet to read. And this was a book that had sat on that shelf top of dresser for maybe a year. I think I got it from a public library sale and I just hadn't read it. So I finally picked it up. It wasn't like anything I was reading, but I actually ended up giving it 5 stars. So this book, I don't know if I already said the title, but it's The Last True Poets of the Sea by Julia Drake. And I don't know why I love this book so much, honestly, thinking about it, but I really did. And let me just read my Goodreads review for it, because I feel like no one can say it better than I did in the moment after I read it. So I said, I wasn't expecting to like this book as much as I did. At the risk of sounding corny, it has more heart than anything I've read in a while. It felt real in a way that, like the 16-year-old protagonist, no one has anything to truly figure out. Was it cliche in parts? Absolutely, but sometimes so is life, and this book has so many good bits that ultimately make it easy to love. So if you can't tell from this review, I'm definitely a little bit of a sucker for some, like, I don't know, just commentary on the human condition through like the eyes of a child. And while there were for sure cliches, which I know I criticized other books for in the past, I don't really mind it so much with like maybe like realistic fiction or just like fiction in general that's not like innately creative like fantasy. I mind cliches and genres like that because the whole point is to be creative. But in terms of this book, in like the young adult genre, I believe it fits in. I don't know. I just like, there was something so charming about this. I think the setting was so cute, and just like the not having everything truly figured out, I think resonated with me, especially because I read this like in the first, I mean, I think the other date on this is January. So I read it basically as I was in the thick of college application process, of the college application process, and just figuring out like where I was going and stuff, and reading this book that reassured me that everything was going to be okay. I don't know. It made me feel really good, and it's cheesy, and I know it. Not necessarily a quality literature book, but I definitely recommend it for like people who like young adult or just like a heartfelt feel good story. I would recommend it. So the next book I read in 2024 is The Wings of Ebony by J.L. Now, I don't remember this book as well, and strangely, I didn't write a review, but I rated it 3 stars. I remember thinking, gosh, this is going to be a while, but I remember thinking like the world and characters were interesting, but I didn't necessarily connect with like the narrative arc as a whole. It felt very much set up as like the first book in a series, and I'm not sure from memory how well it functioned on its own. Like it kind of, I don't know, it felt like a slog in some parts, and I can't exactly identify why, because like I said, I liked its characters, and obviously I like fantasy because that's like half of the books on this list. So I'm not really sure about this one. Let me know if you've read Wings of Ebony and what you think about it, because not only can I not remember too well, and the fact that I don't have my review on Goodreads doesn't help, because that helps to jog my memory a lot, but I don't know. Let me know if you read this book, how you felt about it. But yeah, I thought it was a fresh take on fantasy for sure. I appreciated like, from what, again, I don't want to say anything like incorrect, but I remember there being like inclusions of African culture, but also like African American culture, which I think is something definitely not as prominent in the fantasy genre, so it was also nice to see like a take on that and like an author of color writing a book like this, which again, I thought it was good. I just like can't exactly remember why I didn't connect with it as well. I don't know. You'll have to let me know down below in the comments if anyone has read it, because I actually really want to hear your thoughts if you've read it, because I just can't like put my finger on why I gave it 3 stars. The next book I read is Passing by Nella Larson. So this was for my modern class. I read a lot of weird books for this class, but this was actually like one of the better books that I read for the class. I'm just going to read like my review just to kind of jog my memory, and then also like let you guys know what I thought at the time. I gave it a 4 stars on Goodreads. I said, "This book is a great work of modern fiction. The prose is haunting, the subject matter ever applicable, and the questions raised deep. I love an unreliable narrator, and Irene is that. I also did guess the twist with Claire at the beginning of part 2. I'm not the hugest fan of short fiction books. I prefer long character arcs, but this was definitely one of the better ones that I've read." So yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. To the point of my review, I do love an unreliable narrator. I think that's such an interesting, I guess, like fiction trope, and it makes it really interesting, I think, for the reader as well, because it's a way of not hand-holding your audience to the extreme, because then the audience kind of has to figure out for themselves why this person is ultimately unreliable, if they ever even figure it out. So I liked this book. Very short. I would recommend it for a short read, or if you like modern, oh, that was bad. Anyway, if you like modern fiction, and if you're looking for a short read with an unreliable narrator, I would definitely recommend this one. It was good, and I liked it. Oh man, this was one of the big heavy hitters of this year. I added this to all-time faves, which on my Goodreads is a big deal, because I believe there's only like 5 books living over there on that shelf right now. So this is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I really can't with like the French adjacent last names, or just like any French pronunciation. Not the best at pronouncing it, but we all know Rebecca. At least I'd hope we do. It is a classic, and I think it's one of those classics that's not necessarily at the forefront of the cultural zeitgeist in a way that like books like Pride and Prejudice or Jane Austen are, just because I think it has like a lack of successful adaptations, and that's kind of one reason I think it's fallen by the wayside, especially like in 2024. However, that is not a reason to discount this book, because I gave it 5 out of 5 stars and I loved it so much. I'm just going to read this review because, again, it kind of captures how I felt about it at the time, and then I'll talk about it after. I said, "Brilliant in every sense of the word. Oh my God, I'm really tripping myself up about this. Anyway, the author is incredible. Her prose is out of this world, and how she created this amazing of a novel, I'll never know. The details are vibrant, the characters convincing, but more than anything, our main character is what makes this book. You feel with her, worry with her, and everything she thinks and feels as the novel progresses is so painfully human. Perfect! Exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark." So, needless to say, I loved this book. Now, this is also kind of relating to why I said I liked Passing. Basically, it's not so much that our main character is an unreliable narrator, but it's that the author does such an amazing job of kind of like bringing you into the world of the main character and making you see through her eyes, that in parts when she's manipulated and, you know, like convinced of certain things, obviously because this book is kind of a, I don't know, not, I guess, mystery kind of, but it's not necessarily a thriller mystery. It's more just like a cozy mystery, I guess. But anyway, because we're so in line with the main character, like through the prose style, the surprises, even though they're not fundamentally surprising, feel very shocking because of how great of a job the author does of kind of like putting you in the shoes of the main character, but not even just the main character, just like the setting and everything around the novel. Basically just like everything in the novel is so perfect. And God, I would really, really, really recommend, please read Rebecca if you haven't. And if you have, please let me know down below in the comments what you think about it, because I really hope people love it as much as I do. Obviously, it's a classic for a reason, so I know people do, but if you haven't, I'd really recommend it, especially because I feel that it's not as popular as deserved. Like I said, it's not necessarily one of like the classics you think of. It's kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit, and I really hate that because it's such a perfect and well done book. I really, 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 really love it. So the next book I read in 2024 was Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus, and basically, if you haven't heard of this book, I don't know where you've been. I'm a little late to this trend, honestly, too. I believe I gave it I mean, 5 stars. Anything else would be a crime. This is one of those books where it's popular for a reason, but it's not just popular necessarily, like I'd say on Book Talk, like a book like Light Lark. It's also mainstream popular, like did very well in the New York Times best-selling list, obviously. And honestly, I was late to this party, and I'm so sad that I was, because I don't know, it just took me a sec to get around to it. And once I finally had the time, I believe I read this on spring break, I just could not put it down. It is amazing, surprisingly humorous, yet still deep at the same time, which I think is such an impressive balance to be able to strike, especially as an author, because there's not necessarily that comedic timing that can come across in things like, for example, films or other media. Instead, it's just the words. And I think having this, or like striking a balance of serious tension and comedic elements, is such a fine line. And the author of this just does it so well. It's such an amazing story. It makes you want to cry and just laugh, and I don't know, and ultimately it's hopeful and it's lovely, and really, if you haven't read it, I'd really recommend it. It is also not just necessarily a story, I guess, like for girls. I know that's a stereotype people may think by like the cover, like it's hot pink, etc. But I did give this to a male friend of mine, and he really loved it. Everyone that I have known to read this book loves this book, so please give it a chance. Please do it for me and report back. And if you've read it already, let me know what you thought. So next, I read Girl on the Train. Now, this novel had been sitting on the shelf, which I'm looking at right now, for a very long time. So I finally cracked it out on spring break. I gave this a 3 stars on Goodreads. I'm going to read my review because I don't necessarily remember exactly what I thought. So let's figure it out. I said, an entertaining novel, not the most deep nor profound book. However, it was a fast read and kept me hooked. Felt bad for Rachel the whole time and basically guessed the plot twist halfway through. Decent. So I guess like that's about what I thought of it. It was kind of, well, first of all, it wasn't too long. So the points, I guess, that were being raised in it had to be resolved quite quickly. And to my point about guessing the plot twist, that was kind of probably why I was able to guess the plot twist. Also, I read a lot, so that may have helped. But yeah, I don't know. I thought this was a pretty good book. If you like thriller, kind of mystery, or like if you're a fan of, I guess, like any genre of true crime, like say you like true crime podcasts, I don't know, give this book a read. Maybe it'll be up your alley. I thought it was good, but again, like nothing overly stellar. It reminds me as well of like some of those like really popular reads that are kind of like super, super, super popular for a second and kind of fade by the wayside as time goes on. They're good, entertaining, but nothing like absolutely stellar. I would recommend though, if you need like a short read, or I don't even know, just a light read. It's not necessarily light. There is like some elements, but I wouldn't say it's like terribly gory. The one element that isn't necessarily the most like upbeat and positive is the main character is really struggling throughout like the whole book, and that's kind of a little hard to read. So I guess just be mindful of that, and like if you're up for that. The next book I read was Ithaca. This is in part of a series. It's called the Songs of Penelope series. This is by Claire North. Now, if you know me and if you listen to any of my reading videos on this channel, you know that I am a Greek myth retelling fiend. I just think there's something so charming about these stories not only being brought back, but kind of brought back in a new context, and also just like being accessible to a new generation of people. I was kind of a Greek myths nerd before this literary trend even started. Like I was a Percy Jackson girl. I loved all the myths. I read like separate books as well that weren't just attached to that franchise, and I always really loved them. So seeing all these stories kind of come back is just something that I guess fundamentally interests me, and is why I pick up a lot of these books. So I gave this 5 stars, which is really high praise. I mean, I don't know. I technically do rate books pretty high on my Goodreads, but a 5 stars is hard to come by. So I'm going to read my review just to like see what I thought of it at the time. I mean, wow. This one just might make the all-time favorites list. There is something so enchanting about North's writing style. She absolutely spins a poetic tale and has some of the most unique writing I've seen in a long time. Love, love, love. So if you can tell, I loved this book. I think it's really interesting, and it also does a great job, I think, of painting like the women's stories in ancient Greece, because I think a lot of times, like obviously ancient Greece was a patriarchy, you know, like the men were in power, whatever. But I think this book does a really good job of highlighting kind of the stories and the women behind the scenes in a way that I think other books, like other ancient Greek retellings, try to, but don't necessarily succeed at. This is one of the first ones where I've seen it really kind of encompassed that whole idea in a way that I thought was really like not only important, but just like interesting to read about, and made for a very memorable and, like I said, I guess like poetic tale a little bit too, because the writing style of the author was just so amazing. I really can't rave about it enough. If you are a fan of ancient Greek retellings, and even if you're not, you should please go check out Ithaca by Claire North, because I don't know, I was blown away. It doesn't have the greatest reviews on Goodreads, but I just think the writing style was so amazing. And when you get like a great writing style combined with an already timeless tale, there's just something that like can't be beat about that. Okay, so the next book I read in 2024 was Grendel by John Gardner. Now, I already mentioned I was in a modern class at this time, so if you can't already guess, this book was a byproduct of that class. I actually rated it a lot higher than I think it deserved. I don't know. I gave it a 4 stars, but I changed it to a 3 just now because I don't know. This book was just not only not easy to read. Obviously, you have to kind of know a little bit of context about the original Beowulf to even like be able to decode this story, but it was written in such a nonsensical and like, I don't even know if non-linear is the right word, but just confusing format that even if you had read the original Beowulf like I have, it just didn't make sense. And there was a lot of things that needed translating from my English teacher that it was just like, oh my God, how could anyone have guessed that reading this as a normal person? So honestly, I wouldn't recommend reading this on your own time unless you're like super into Beowulf or even just like modern literature at all. It's definitely very like existentialist, and I don't know, it just like wasn't the best. And I think there's a very high barrier to entry for this one. So I would not recommend this for just like the casual book reader, because you may be getting yourself into something that you're not prepared for. And even myself, as a very frequent book reader, was still a little bit like, oh my God, what is actually going on? And to be fair, modern literature isn't necessarily my favorite form of literature, so maybe that might also be why. But I just think there were so many things that it was like, how could you even know that if you didn't look it up online or have someone telling it to you like my modern teacher was telling it to us? So that was just my thought. Maybe not recommend, but if you have read it and you liked it, let me know what you thought down below. All right, so the next book I read was The Joys of Motherhood by Bucci. Oh my God, I feel like I'm butchering these names and I'm terribly sorry. Bucci Emecheta. Basically, it's a pretty famous book, so just look up The Joys of Motherhood and ignore my terrible pronunciation. So I gave this a 3 stars, and I'm just going to read my review and then talk a little bit about it. This was for an AP Lit unit as well. So I wrote, overall pretty depressing, unfortunately. I tend to like books with a happy ending. However, it was well written and did a good idea of reflecting the Nigerian cultural norms and how colonization has changed that. So I pretty much stand by my review. I think that it was a very well written book. The only reason I didn't give it a few more stars is just because I tend to favor, I guess, like positive or at least literature that paints some positive spin on life or even just like the subject matter, and I didn't feel like that was going on here at all. It was a pretty depressing book, and honestly, maybe I'm just like an excessive optimist, but I found it kind of hard to get through just because it was like, oh my God, bad thing after bad thing after bad thing. And while I understand that reflects a lot of the realities of life for people, especially kind of like with this change of colonization and the cultural norms being shifted, and just like how does the culture and society adapt to that, I understand that there's a lot of nuance there, but overall, just as a book and how it functions as a book, I found it maybe a little depressing for my taste, but nonetheless, obviously I said in the review, still well written and brings up a lot of like interesting cultural topics. Okay, so the next book that I read was The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper, and this one was amazing. Now, I know this is also kind of like, it's not ancient Greek, it's technically like Roman retelling, but it gives kind of a similar vibe, however, without kind of the outline that I think a lot of ancient retellings, like without the outline of a story that a lot of ancient retellings rely on, right? Like, for example, Ithaca was centered around a myth. The Wolf Den is completely its own story and kind of like own narrative with like historical events loosely woven in there, basically. So I gave this a 5 stars. I loved this book. I loved this whole trilogy, honestly. I'm going to read my review and then yap a little bit, but I think the review would be interesting for this one. So I wrote, yeah, this was great. I was hooked from the beginning. Warning, it is full of violence, sexual, otherwise, but it also tells a very important story of the people whose backs ancient cities ran on, like Pompeii. I understand Amara, and I can't wait to read the rest of her story. It's about a like brothel worker in Pompeii, obviously ancient Rome, and it was such an interesting and original book. I think that where Greek retellings such as like Ithaca stand out from their prose style, not necessarily from their stories. This one stood out for the prose style and the story because of how great of a job it did of kind of capturing the ancient Roman, I guess, like culture and customs, but also creating a story of its own that was unique but also plausible to be able to fit into that culture. I think that's something really special, and I really, really, really loved this book. I think it was really good. So the next one I read, to no surprise, was the second one in this series. I gave this a 4 stars. I'm going to read my review. I don't think I have a review for the third one, but I did read all 3. So my review for the second one reads, yeah, this one was great too. I will say it wasn't as quite as flawless of a tale as the first one. The beats of it were predictable, and some character motivations and events felt very uncharacteristic, as though the author just changed them for plot convenience. With that said, I enjoyed this book. So I still gave it a 5 stars just because the prose style didn't automatically change, but I think there were some kind of like central character conflicts and motivations that happened in this book that I don't necessarily think were, I guess, plausible is a way of saying it. I don't know. I still really liked it, and I read the whole trilogy, so obviously I liked all of it. I don't have my review for the last one, but I gave it a 4 stars as well, which means pretty good. And I remember liking it pretty well. It definitely was a satisfying ending, and I appreciated kind of like the conclusion to the trilogy, and just like also that book, I believe, talked a lot about the kind of the horror of Pompeii, because this is the book when like that actually occurs, and it was just kind of an interesting, not only conclusion but also just culmination of something that you can kind of tell was looming over the story the whole time, because obviously if it's set in Pompeii, we all have the cultural context to know that. So I think it was interesting to wrap up the historical events which with also kind of the character events and like the character arcs, and I think it did a really good job. I liked all 3. The next book I read was for Modern. This was Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer. I gave this a 4 stars. I'm going to read my review just because I don't necessarily remember this one as well, just because it was for a class. All right, so I wrote, this is a surprisingly good book. It was a school read, so I wasn't expecting much. However, it was very heartfelt. I will say that this is not a book to read without brain power. You do have to be paying attention, as sometimes the perspectives will shift. Loved it. So I really liked this one. I think the multimedia inclusions in this book were definitely interesting and made it kind of a faster read, I'd say. But like I said, it wasn't necessarily an easy read. You do kind of have to have like brain on. This isn't something to necessarily read if you're looking for a light, I guess, or like, you know, I guess easy read. I can't think of a better way to say that. I'm tired. But my point being is that you do have to be paying attention, but it isn't necessarily like the most difficult book. Again, the multimedia inclusions make it pretty easy, and I thought it was pretty easy to follow along with. There were maybe like a few references I missed that my teacher helped me get, but nothing that wouldn't make this book an enjoyable read if you perhaps like didn't know a little bit of the context or whatever. But I thought it was great. Definitely existentialist as well, but existentialist in more of like a positive and very raw sense. I think it did a great job of capturing like, I guess, like the conflict of humanity and what it is to live. And I think it's also amazing because it's written through the eyes of a child. It's written through Oscar's perspective, and it just really, I'm not sure, maybe it's the author, I haven't read any of their books by him, but he knocked it out of the park with the perspective, like especially from Oscar's point of view, because oh my gosh, I really did feel like an 8-year-old was talking to me throughout this book, and it made it surprisingly heartbreaking but also just like meaningful and raw. And I think it added that sense of, I guess, brutal honesty that I think oftentimes kids bring to a conversation. And it takes place around 9/11, so there's obviously a lot of trauma that the main character has to process, but I think it's a really unique story from a really unique perspective, and I really liked it. I thought it was surprisingly hopeful despite like the existentialist material, which obviously I've already stated, like that's something I appreciate in a book. The next book I read was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. Now, if you've been on the internet or kind of like book social media at all, this is not a new one to you. However, I did give this a 3 stars. Guys, please don't come for me in the comments. Just like, I'd love to hear your perspectives, but keep it respectful, because I know Sarah J. Maas fans can get a little feral, especially because there's a lot of them and they really love her books, which I totally respect. Obviously, she's very successful and influential. Just because I'm not as much of a fan of her books doesn't mean I don't respect that. She clearly knows what she's doing. So my review said, one thing I will say about this is Maas does a great job of absolutely jam-packing this plot. It distracts from her less than excellent writing in this novel and makes, on the whole, an excellent read. I don't know if I said excellent. No, I said entertaining. Not necessarily excellent, but entertaining, I agree with my past self, is a good way to describe this book, especially because I don't know. It keeps you moving throughout the plot, but there's just a lot of stuff going on where it's like, were you even planning this? And I just don't feel like she executed as well on the premise of like an assassin going to the ball, like this different version of Cinderella. It was really just a whole different story that kind of like used that hook as an elevator pitch. So I don't know. I feel like it could have done better. I'm sorry, guys. I'm really sorry. And I love fantasy, so I wanted to like it so badly, but I just felt like it was too all over the place, and the series kind of like only gets even more so, but we'll get to that in a second. So the next book I read, this was also for modern, was The Handmaid's Tale. I rated this a 4 stars. I don't really know what to say about this book. I mean, it's obviously a classic. It's really well written, but yeah. Basically, my review was, Atwood's literary skills remain amazing. This one hits a little too close to home, for sure. So I think that encapsulates my thoughts pretty well. Definitely a controversial book and has been banned, but I think it's a really important dystopian tale of kind of like what happens with not only censorship, but just kind of like fear-mongering and how like very quickly a society can slip from being normal to just like this absolute insanity that's going on in The Handmaid's Tale. It's definitely interesting. Not for the faint of heart, but a good dystopian read, and definitely a solid novel. Obviously, Margaret Atwood's like super talented. I've read a bunch of her short stories, so the prose did not disappoint either, but the subject matter is definitely a little disturbing. Sorry if the camera angle changed a bit. We're back. My camera died, but we're gonna finish it off. So the next thing I read was The Crown of Midnight, which is obviously Throne of Glass #2. Now for these next few books in the series, I'm just gonna read my Goodreads reviews, because I was actually considering doing a different Sarah J. Maas video, and I actually have a potential long-term project that has to do with reading and obviously YouTube, because that's what I do. So I'm probably going to discuss it on there, which will be like a separate video. So if you're interested in that, just let me know. But for now, we will read the reviews. So I gave Crown of Midnight 4 stars, and I said, I consider this book a rarity, as it is a hard task not to only make the second book better, but to improve the prose by this much. Still not groundbreaking writing, but the drastic change in writing ability between the first book and this gives me hope and makes me want to keep reading, whereas I didn't feel moved to read more after the first book. The twist ending was good, too. Didn't guess that one. So, positive, I'd say, which is not going to be a theme for my thoughts on the rest of the series. So, my review for Heir of Fire, which is book 3 and Throne of Glass, I gave it a 3 stars, and I said, well, honestly, I have no idea what's going on anymore. It feels like this series have been 3 separate fantasy books that I happened to read around the same time. I'm not sure if that comes from the poor writing of the first book, but there feels like non-existent setup for everything, therefore ensuring a limited payoff. And that is kind of my thoughts on the rest of the books. I then went on to read Queen of Shadows, I gave it a 3. Empire of Storms, I gave a 3. I do have a rating for Empire of Storms that says meh. Honestly, just here for the vibes at this point. One redeeming part of this book was Elodie. I like her. That grand reveal was all very silly. Not sure what's going on, but I will finish this eventually. Famous last words. That was the last book I read in the series. Sorry, guys. Sorry. I don't know. I couldn't finish it. There was no attraction. Please let me know if I'm missing something, but it just wasn't that great, honestly. And like, I find that my one comment that I made about very little setup and like even littler payoff is very true. At least I feel for this series as a whole. Again, I'll save my whole thoughts for later, so I won't ramble too much on this, but I feel like my meh rating is about how I feel. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. I'm totally going to get absolutely flamed for this, but I would love to hear your thoughts and why you liked it. If you liked it, please actually share why you liked Throne of Glass. If you liked Throne of Glass, I actually need to hear that, because I need to hear that people actually liked it, because I've talked to several other people, like friends and family, and they were not that big of a fan either. I don't know. So the next book I read is The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner. So this was another bookshelf classic that I got from a little free library, and it had just been sitting there, and yeah, I gave this 2 stars, so maybe not recommend. My review says, just meh. Split perspectives were too much and distracted from the plot, even though they were meant to fit together. I never really got it. It only really got exciting the last 100 pages, and even then, what even was that plot twist? Getting rid of one of the characters was just not necessary, even more so when the author then reversed that decision. This just needed a few more edits, I fear. Didn't feel well developed or thought out. I mean, Past Me said it best. I actually quite agree with that review. That was just, I don't know, it was kind of a meh book, and it was so upsetting because I feel like, again, just like how I felt about Throne of Glass, they have this amazing elevator pitch like idea, you know, they have an amazing idea and thought behind them. And Throne of Glass, it was going to the balls and he's as the assassin. Cinderella going to the ball as the assassin. Hello, I need to go to bed. And in The Lost Apothecary, it was about like an apothecary poisoning people in 1800s London. Like, hello, those are both so interesting things. And writing, in my opinion, lackluster books with those with those premises feels like a crime, because I feel like there just could have been so much and it didn't really float my boat, but maybe it did other people's. I don't know. So the last, I'm going to say book, however, this is a book series. However, I'm going to talk about the first one, kind of read the reviews, etc. I think I'm just going to read you my first one and then tell you that I read the rest. So the last book I read was The Princess Diaries. And basically I was feeling a little burnt out with reading after The Lost Apothecary and just like all of those gosh darn Sarah J. Maas books. Was not a fan. So I was feeling a little burnt out and I need to go back to something that would make me love reading again and just be easy read, you know, an easy read. So I gave this a 5 stars. It was amazing. I'm going to read my review. I said, I love this book. I picked it up looking for something easy to read, something I knew that would be good after a few less than stellar books. Oh boy, if you haven't read this since you were 13 like me, please do. The humor is surprisingly witty even to an adult, and the character voice is remarkably developed for a diary-style narrative. Love, love, love. I found my next summer series, I suppose. And that review is absolutely right. I went on to read quite literally all of them until the number 10 installment. And again, this is a book series I think I'm going to discuss in that potential future book-related project I was hinting about. So I will discuss them, never to fear. I don't think I gave any of the books less than a 4 stars. Okay, so I definitely say good overall. Like I said in my review, one thing that really, really, really impressed me about this series was the humor. Oh my gosh, it's so funny and it has this kind of subtle, I don't know, it's not adult humor, but it's good humor when you're a teenager when you read these books. And then it's also amazing humor when you're older. Like, it just, I don't know, it just has this undertone. And not even an undertone, I don't know. I just think the jokes are funny for all ages, is what I'm trying to say. And it's amazing. It's so amazing. If you only knew The Princess Diaries was a movie, oh my god, please read the books. They're so easy to read, so quick. That's the reason why like my Goodreads book count is quite high right now, because I just absolutely demolished those and I'm a little bit lost now. So hopefully I will find something new to read. If you have any recommendations and stay till this far, please leave them down in the comments down below. I'm always looking for a next book. I love using the library, so honestly that's what I've been doing lately. That's why I haven't had any book hauls, because I don't know, it just is really helpful, I think, to support your local library, and it's so easy, at least for me. I love a good library, so that's where I've been renting them from, and checking them out from. So please give me lots of recs. Again, money is not really an issue because I'm not buying all of them, so I can just request them from the library. And again, thank you so much for staying to this point. If you stayed to this point, please subscribe, because I don't know, it just really helps me out, and I'm really working on growing my little family over here on YouTube. I've been posting every week and I really enjoy you all tuning in. And without further ado, I'll see you guys next week. Thanks so much for sitting down with me and listening to me yap. I hope you found at least a few new books to read, or like something to put on your list, or maybe something that you know a family or like a friend would like to read. Basically, I just hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!